So it looks like we've got everybody back from the breakout rooms. Really aware that the last discussions have opened up lots more questions than they've probably answered. And this is okay, because we're not asking you really to make decisions now. It's opened up some of the issues and the questions and the considerations that the group that are tasked with really taking a deep dive into this idea around energy generation and the possibility or potential for more onshore wind. These are the types of things that they'll be spending really the whole of the next block that we're together, learning more about, getting more information about, and weighing up some of these trade-offs that were starting to come up in the conversations you were just having. So really it's just to give everyone a bit of an introduction to all of the three topics before we do split up. So we are going to move on now to our next topic. And our next topic really around the challenge of kind of reducing car and road use while maintaining the importance of being able to, the mobility, the ability to be able to get where people need to go. So pleased now to introduce Nik Bowyer from the Chartered Institutions of Highways and Transportation, who's going to give us a bit of an introduction into this topic and why it is a challenge.
Great, thanks very much, Kayla. And hi everyone, it's really a pleasure to be here this morning. And you've got such an important role that, I really envy the process you're going through over the next few weeks in terms of setting out the challenges that we have and deliberating on them. So congratulations on being involved. Just before I start, I'll just check you can all see my screen. Hopefully you can do.
Yep.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so what I want to do over the next 15 minutes is just take you through some of the challenges that we have around transport and try and set that into the context of what is the implication for transport in Devon, and really trying to set out some definitions around terminology that you may or may not be familiar with, just so you've got that knowledge base going into the next sets of deliberations. And really, what's important? Why is this an important topic? Well, mobility, and this is a term that you're going to see coming up quite a lot through the discussions, is about how we move. So it's nothing more than that. It's how we move around, and that's something that affects all of us, all users, whether that's walking, whether it's cycling. It doesn't have to be by taking a car trip or making a trip by bus or rail, but we all do it. We all have reasons for traveling, and it's important to recognize that everyone's reasons are quite varied. But really, we can break this down into a few separate topic areas. So traveling to and from work. Now, there's lots of different reasons why people need to travel to and from work. That may have changed over the past year and a half as a result of the pandemic that we've had. But there's no reason why that may change going forward. So, we may end up moving back to our pre-pandemic state, but the plan that we have set out assumes that we will not be necessarily working in the same way as we have done in the past. We might travel to visit our friends and family. Again, that's something that is a really key reason. We all want to socialize. We're all quite social animals. And, we have to travel in order to do that. We now have more interconnected lives than we ever have done in the past. And traveling is really important in order to help us facilitate those social connections that we have. We may want to go on holiday. And again, this is a particularly important consideration for Devon. Devon is one of the tourism capitals of the UK. And it's not just people in Devon who affect travel here. We get lots of people traveling in and out of Devon as well. And finally, for leisure purposes. So we all travel in some form in order to shop, to go out to the gym, to go out for recreational purposes, such as going out for a meal. And again, there's lots of different ways that we might do this. So just to set in context the challenge that we have in Devon, transport is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Devon. Now, that's second only to the built environment when we start to combine residential and commercial emissions together. So it's really key, and it's playing a massive role in Devon's emissions at the moment, but also means that we've got to do a lot in order to drive those down. Just to put that into some set of context, around 31% of Devon's emissions arise as a result of transport. Now, that's not too different from the national picture. Devon's not that different from what's happening across the UK as a whole. But there's a different component build-up of that. So within the UK's emissions, there's a larger source of aviation emissions, so flying. Devon's are mostly derived from what we term surface transport. So that's anything that's moving on the ground. So basically anything that's not a plane or not a boat. And that's predominantly cars, vans, lorries, buses, and rail as well. So rail fits into this piece. But I think it's important just to note at this time that train movements account for about 1% of that. So it's very small. So it's basically anything on the road that we're talking about. Now, in terms of what is emitting and the reasons that people are making journeys and emitting greenhouse gases, it's really cars that are the problem. So out of that 29% that we mentioned earlier, around 2/3 of all of our trips are made by car. So I think there's a bit of a misconception in some people's minds occasionally that maybe it's lorries and dirty HGVs running around taking up traffic space. They only account for around less than 1/3 of all emissions. So it's really the movement of people that is key. And I think the other thing, just to put into context as well, is the anecdotes around how it's people who are traveling for work, people who are traveling to drop their children off at school that are causing a lot of the problems on the road. Now, there's a difference here that I think it's worth just highlighting, in that whilst those users may be contributing to peak congestion, so what happens in the morning hour, the evening hour, really those commuting trips only make up 1 in 6 trips on the road network. Very few are business trips, and most of it is for all those other reasons that people might want to travel that we've talked about. So it's those personal trips that are really causing the vast majority of emissions that we see. And again, just to put this into context, while the movement of goods, so vans, lorries, is important, really the key challenge is around the key challenge is around reducing the emissions that come out of those car trips. So again, why is it important that we look to reduce transport emissions? Well, since 1990, emissions from transport have fallen the slowest of any sector of the economy in the UK. And again, this picture is the same in Devon. So the graph that you can see on the left-hand side here is showing total greenhouse gas emissions for the UK. And we can see that they have been falling since 1990. The line at the bottom shows the transport emissions. So that's emissions solely coming from road transport. So again, the cars, the vans, and the lorries that we've just talked about. And you can see that what's happened there is that they've remained relatively flat across that period. So they've not really reduced to the same degree as we've seen in other sectors. So again, this is a big problem because we're starting from a position where we need to reduce a lot more in a shorter space of time if we're going to reach net zero. And there's various reasons for this, but primarily the reason is that in real terms, the cost of travel by car has become cheaper over that period. And in particular, you may look at policies such as the freezing of fuel duty, which have contributed to that. And I think at this point, it's just worth noting that 98% of the car fleet is still based on fossil fuel sources. So that's fuels that are derived from oil, so petrol, diesel. So it's a really big problem. So if we're wanting to move from a position where we have the single largest sector of emitting emissions, and we want to get that down to net zero, how do we go about doing that? Well, principally, there's only 2 real ways that you can get there. One is to reduce traffic, and 2 is to decarbonize the fleet. So by that, decarbonizing the fleet, we mean switching from petrol and diesel vehicles to those that are ultra low emissions or electric. Now, on the image on the right-hand side here, I've put electric because that's by far the industry leader, and certainly it's the favored position of government that we switch to electric vehicles as soon as possible. But really, it's worth just bearing in mind here that there are other technologies out there for reducing our emissions. So that could be hydrogen fueled, which may certainly have a role to play in terms of lorries and also on the rail network potentially. Now, in terms of the way that we can get to net zero, the quickest possible way to do it is to decarbonize our fleet. So that's moving from a position where now we have about 2% or so, sorry, 10% of new sales being made by electric vehicles to 100% of those new sales being electric vehicles. And the government has set out a timetable around that. So by 2030, sales of internal combustion engine vehicles, so that's petrol or diesel, will be stopped. And then by 2035, plug-in hybrids will also be stopped. But as we see in the evidence coming forward, it takes a long time in order for that change to propagate through to the vehicle fleet mix as a whole. So there's a lag basically between new sales and what the fleet on the road looks like. And even in Norway, where we see that they're a clear leader in this technology, and say new sales of electric vehicles are really high, around 80%, it's taking a long time for that to propagate through into the whole fleet that they have. Now, the other challenge around just relying on electric vehicles in order to get there is the fact that it doesn't reduce carbon enough. So I mentioned earlier that we had not cut as a transportation sector emissions quite as quickly as others, and in particular the fact that we've relatively flatlined in that period since 1990. And the evidence shows that basically even if we successfully transition to electric vehicles by 2030, we still need to reduce either the number of trips or the length of the trips that we're making by around 10 to 20% in order to get emissions down to net zero. So that's a really key challenge, and we can't just rely on moving to electric vehicles. We need to reduce the amount of traffic on our roads. And really that's achieved through either stopping travel altogether, so reducing the need to travel, or shifting to more sustainable modes. And for mid-distance journeys, that could be switching to bus, it could be switching to rail. For shorter journeys, that may involve switching to walking or cycling more. And there's various actions that we've signposted in the interim carbon plan around how we may go about doing that. I think the other point that's just worth noting is that we need to reduce 10 to 20% the amount of journeys that are made, even alongside those electric vehicles. And we're just going to have to put that in the position that the population in Devon is forecast to grow by around 7% from today's numbers to the time when electric vehicle sales will be 100%, so 2030. And then by the mid-2040s, where we're looking to be in that space where we're close to net zero, 15% population growth. So there's going to be even more demand for people to move around. So as part of the assembly, you've been asked to look or to discuss what we could do in order to encourage less car use. And that's really taking the context that we've just seen and how we can stabilize or even reduce road capacity. So that's how we can take space away just from cars and maybe move it elsewhere. So maybe creating cycle lanes, maybe creating bus lanes, alongside potential mechanisms that help us to reduce our car levels and usage. So that's the carrots and sticks, as we mentioned earlier. And that can be around financial incentives or financial disincentives. And there is a challenge around this in that whatever we do in Devon isn't necessarily going to be replicated elsewhere. So on our borders, Somerset, Dorset, Cornwall could take a different approach. And there will still be movements from those areas and in fact from far wider in the UK in and out of Devon that will need to be influenced in some way. So in terms of why it's a challenge, we've been through the context, but really changing people's behaviour is quite difficult, particularly if the alternatives to their current situation or the status quo are considered to be more tricky. So for instance, a journey by car may take an hour. A journey by public transport could take an hour and a half and involve changing somewhere where you have some dead time changing. That's less attractive. Also, all solutions aren't necessarily one size fits all. In Devon, we've got a really interesting dichotomy of urban and rural context. So we have some very urbanized areas. We've also got some very deep rural areas where the same solutions that we might implement in our towns and cities won't work, and another option or another set of changes is required. And then there's other evidence. So the Department for Transport, for instance, which Devon normally has to go to in order to seek funds for its transportation system, it uses in the current context, it uses formulae in order to work out where investment should go by determining what the economic benefits to an area may be. And road building is often seen to be perceived to bring an economic benefit. So we improve connections in and out of an area, promote investment within an area, and that's what road schemes are said to lead to. And with the current mechanisms, it's quite easy to identify what those may be, and less so for walking and cycling schemes, for instance. Around those walking and cycling schemes, around public transport, there's an awful lot of co-benefits that we can cite in terms of increased use of those. So by co-benefits, I mean advantages and improvements to people's health, for instance, improvements to air quality. And those are quite difficult to value and set in the context of an economic benefit. So they may not be perceived as well as what a short-term impact on someone's travel time improvement might be from a road building scheme. And also we've got a regulatory challenge. So current rules and regulations around public transport, for instance, in particular how buses are run outside of London, can make having an integrated system quite difficult. Things have to be commercially viable. Routes will not necessarily consider connections with other parts of the public transport network. So we don't necessarily timetable buses and trains to run well together. And really, some of these are real key inhibitors to sort of having a one timetable, one brand, one pricing mechanism. So a single ticket essentially across modes that makes travel easier. And the other challenge around this is around equity. So if we start to introduce financial mechanisms, do we start penalizing areas of society that can less afford it? There's a huge challenge there. So I just want to spend the next 2 slides before handing back, just talking around some potential actions that could be taken in order to reduce car use, but still be able to ensure that people can travel around as they need to. So first, I'm just going to concentrate on some of the sticks that we may use in order to get people out of their cars. One could be that we look to reduce speed limits across Devon. The numbers here are just for representation, but for instance, we could consider blanket 20-mile-per-hour areas in our 20-mile-per-hour speeds in our urban areas. We could be looking for 50-mile-per-hour maximums in our rural communities. And the evidence shows that by moving to those, we make people's journeys slower. So actually the differential between taking a car and public transport is less. So it's more attractive then to start taking public transport. But also there's an emissions benefit here as well. So cars are more efficient when they're in that space of 50 to 60 miles per hour and rather than above that. We could start to consider some financial mechanisms in order to price people out of cars. And there's various ways that could work. So for instance, a workplace parking levy whereby employers or businesses are charged for the amount of parking spaces that they provide could see them reduce the amount of parking available, and that may encourage the workforce to use alternative means to get to work. Alternatively, we could look at charging the road users themselves. That's the people of Devon who are driving around. That could take the form of congestion charging. So in our larger urban areas, so Plymouth or Exeter, Barnstable even, we might be looking at imposing a charge to enter these central urban areas by car. Very much like what happens in London at the moment. We could start to think about low emission zones. So we charge people who are in non-electric vehicles or more polluting vehicles. Again, that would probably help more in the urban areas. Or we could start to look at increasing car parking charges. These are all financial mechanisms where the funding that's raised from them could be ring-fenced and put into public transport spending to increase the attractiveness of buses and of trains. But again, there's challenges around this in terms of, is it fair to charge people who are currently making a journey. There may be people who really have no other choice but to use their car. Likewise, people who own a car may not be able to afford to upgrade to a less polluting vehicle. And so is this the right way to go? Now, in terms of some of the carrots instead, well, what could we do to attract people to public transport? So rather than trying to push them away from car, what can be done to attract people to public transport? Well, the key reason here would be cheaper public transport. So if we had cheaper fares, integrated tickets, and by that what I mean is you can buy a single ticket that allows you to travel by bus and by train as part of a multi-leg journey. That makes things more attractive. Likewise, if we were to integrate timetables so that you knew if you were going to take a bus, you would then be able to link up with your next train without having to wait for half an hour. That makes the journey more attractive. You've got less of a reason, you've got less dead time in your journey. We could consider true priority for buses throughout their journey lengths. So many of you will have seen bus lanes around some of our urban areas. There are other mechanisms that we can prioritize buses as well. So having more specific signals that are optimized to go green for when a bus appears, having more road space dedicated to buses and taken away from cars for longer sections of journeys rather than just on the approaches to junctions or on one road into a town centre. Again, that would make journey times by bus much quicker. But the converse of that is that it will add additional congestion to people in their cars. So that's where we end up going there. And then finally, there's some things that we can look at that are not necessarily related to public transport, but are more around the active mode usage. So walking and cycling are the least carbon intensive ways of travel. Bikes in particular, bikes and walking don't emit emissions as they're being used. And e-bikes is a great example of where if we could get more of the population using those and encouraged to use them, then some of those longer distance trips, so the more polluting ones that are currently taken by car, so that's the trips that are around 3 miles to 25 miles, could be taken off of the road and switched into bikes. But in order to do that, you need to make the bike mode more attractive. So we need to potentially subsidize bikes. So could we find a mechanism in order to promote people buying them? And also we need to make people feel safe. One of the main barriers to cycling is that people don't feel safe when they're on the roads. So actually removing some of that road space that's dedicated to cars, shifting it to bikes, and actually having what we call segregated routes. So rather than just a white line on a road, having proper segregated routes where bike users are separated from cars, they're safe, they don't interact, could really help in order to facilitate that. So I think my time's probably up. A very quick canter through some of the options that are available. And I think what we'll now do is pass back to Kayla and let her take you to some breakout rooms.